All right, before we really get into the meat and potatoes of who this Wendigo fella really is, what he's all about, I'm showing you what we're working on. Typically, I would draw him on this poster and we would talk about him, but unfortunately, we are all out of real estate. So, I'm going to be drawing him on a piece of paper and we're going to be talking about him. But I wanted to show you guys what we're working on, what we finished up, and let me know what you guys want to see in the future. But anywho, the Wendigo. Just imagine you're completely lonesome by yourself in the wilderness. There's no roads, no houses, no lights, just miles of frozen forest in every direction. The temperature is dropping conveniently. Your food is gone. And somewhere beyond the tree line, something is following you. You turn around, nothing. You keep walking, then you hear it again. Footsteps behind you. But the terrifying part isn't what might be hiding in the forest. It's the possibility that the thing you're afraid of might already be inside you. Pause. This is the story of the Wendigo, one of the most terrifying beings in the folklore of the indigenous peoples of the North Forests of North America. But there's a problem. The Wendigo you see in modern horror movies isn't quite the creature people originally described. The story is much older and much darker. The Wendigo comes from the traditions of several Algonquian speaking indigenous people, including Cree, Oboe, and Algonquian communities. And I'm sorry about that. Surely I didn't pronounce any of that correctly. But anyway, let's move on. Different communities had different versions of the tradition, and there isn't one single universal description. The name itself appears in several forms: Wendigo, Witico, Wendigo. But the basic idea appears again and again: a supernatural force associated with winter, starvation, greed, isolation, and unfortunately cannibalism. And this is where the Wendigo becomes different from an ordinary monster. The Wendigo wasn't simply something that lived in the woods waiting to attack people, like the typical ones we talk about on the channel. Instead, it could represent what happens when a human being crosses a terrible moral boundary. A person consumed by hunger, greed, desperation, and became something else entirely, something no longer considered human. In some traditions, the transformation could literally be supernatural. In others, the emphasis was on possession or a person becoming spiritually corrupted. And the lesson underneath the story was brutally simple. Human beings need one another to survive. In an environment where winter could mean starvation, selfishness wasn't just a character flaw. It could kill an entire community. Here's where the more modern depictions get complicated. Today you've probably seen the Wendigo portrayed as a gigantic, skeletal humanoid with antlers or glowing eyes, an impossibly thin body. That image is all over the place. But the famous antlered deer skull Wendigo isn't a universal feature of traditional Wendigo stories, as you can see what I'm drawing. We left the antlers out, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that's more of a skinwalker trait. But anywho, historical accounts describe the being in many different ways. Sometimes it was enormous, sometimes it was described as human-like, sometimes it was associated with animals, and sometimes the Wendigo wasn't even primarily described as a physical creature. It could be a spirit, a transformation, or a state of possession. So if you imagine the Wendigo as simply a giant deer-headed monster wandering through Canada, you're really looking at a much later interpretation of a much older tradition. The original idea was far more disturbing, because the monster wasn't necessarily something you encountered, it was something you became. Sorry about that. Stories of the Wendigo encounter were recorded by European missionaries, traders, explorers, and anthropologists over the centuries, and some indigenous oral traditions describe encounters that are genuinely eerie. One story recorded from Ojibwe tradition tells of a family traveling through the wilderness. A medicine man suddenly felt that something was wrong. He couldn't see anything, but he sensed danger. He moved his family away from their camp and spent the night on the water. When they returned the next morning, their original camp had been destroyed. They believed a Wendigo had come through. Another story tells of a young girl traveling through the forest at dusk. She heard footsteps behind her. Every time she stopped, the footsteps stopped. Every time she continued, they followed. she became convinced that a Wendigo was pursuing her. She eventually climbed a tree and hid. Below her, the creature waited. She stayed there through the night, and when morning came, it was gone. There aren't eyewitness reports in the modern scientific sense. They're traditional stories passed through generations. But they reveal something important. The Wendigo wasn't just a monster. He represented the terror of being vulnerable in wilderness where a person could disappear without a trace. And then something strange happened. The Wendigo stopped existing only in stories. People began appearing in historical records who were accused of actually becoming a Wendigo. There are documented cases from the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century involving people accused of cannibalism or believed by their communities to be suffering from Wendigo-related spiritual affliction. One of the earliest recorded European accounts comes from the 1700s, and over the following century, these cases became increasingly intertwined with colonial law. European authorities interpreted the events through completely different religious and legal frameworks. For indigenous communities, the problem could be spiritual. For colonial authorities, it could be murder. And sometimes it was both a spiritual crisis and a very real crime. The most famous case would come in Alberta, a Cree hunter known as Swift Runner. Legendary name, I might add. But put yourself there. Winter, 1878, northern Alberta. A Cree hunter and trapper named Swift Runner went into the wilderness with his family. There was his wife, his mother, his brother, and his children. The winter was brutal. Eventually, Swift Runner returned to civilization alone. His family was gone. At first, he claimed they had all died of starvation, but something about the story didn't make sense. Authorities investigated. They traveled into the wilderness and found the remains of his own family. Evidence indicated they had been murdered and cannibalized. Swift Runner eventually confessed. His name isn't as cool anymore, I take it all back. Historical records indicate that he attributed his actions to the Wendigo, a supernatural force associated with cannibalism. The case became one of the most famous historical examples connected to the Wendigo tradition. He was arrested, tried, and convicted, and executed in 1879. But here's what makes the story even more disturbing, if you could believe it. Modern historians examining the surviving records have questioned whether simple starvation explains everything that happened. Research into Swift Runner's confession suggests that at least some of the cannibalism occurred even when food was available. So what happened to him? Was he suffering from a psychological disorder? Maybe. Was he experiencing a spiritual crisis? Potentially. Was the Wendigo belief itself influencing his behavior? Or was he simply a murderer who later used the language of his culture to explain what he'd done? We can't know for certain, and that's what makes the case so haunting. Because unlike a good old monster story, there really was actually a crime. Then there's the case of Jack Fiddler. Jack Fiddler was an Ojibwe leader and spiritual practitioner living in southern Ontario. He became known for something extraordinary. He was considered a Wendigo killer. Now that's a cool name. But that doesn't necessarily mean he was hunting monsters in the forest. According to historical accounts, Fiddler was believed to have the ability to identify people who were becoming Wendigo, people who were believed to be spiritually afflicted, dangerous, or capable of killing and eating others. In 1907, Canadian authorities arrested Jack Fiddler and his brother Joseph. They were accused of killing a woman believed by their community to be suffering from Wendigo affliction. Name's not as cool anymore. For the Canadian authorities, this was murder. For Fiddler's community, the situation existed within a completely different spiritual and legal framework. Jack Fiddler died before his trial could take place, and his case became an unsettling example of two completely different systems of understanding colliding with one another. Eventually, outsiders began using the term Wendigo psychosis to describe supposed cases where indigenous people developed an intense fear that they were becoming cannibals or supernatural beings. But modern scholars have questioned how accurately this concept was applied. Some researchers argue that the idea was exaggerated or misunderstood by outsiders studying indigenous cultures, and this distinction does matter. because for generations the Wendigo was treated by outsiders as simply a bizarre monster myth. But within the cultures that preserved these traditions, the story could carry much deeper meanings. It could be about hunger, greed, isolation, and or community, and the consequences of being selfish, and the terrifying possibility that desperation can make a human being forget what it means to be human, lose their humanity altogether. So, did this fella actually exist? If you're asking whether there's evidence for a gigantic supernatural creature roaming the Canadian wilderness, yes, there is. No, I'm kidding. Unfortunately, there's no reliable scientific evidence proving that yet. The modern image of the Wendigo as a skeletal antlered cryptid is largely a product of later interpretations, popular culture, artwork, movies, games, and internet horror. But that doesn't mean the Wendigo isn't real in another sense, because the people who told these stories were dealing with something very real: cold, hunger, isolation, death, and the fear of losing yourself. The Wendigo may not have needed to exist as a physical monster. Perhaps that was never the point to begin with. Think about what the Wendigo represents: a creature that becomes stronger the more it consumes, a hunger that can never be satisfied. The more it eats, more it needs, and eventually there's nothing left. That's what makes the Wendigo such a powerful horror story, because most monsters represent something outside of us. The Wendigo represents something inside of us, the part that always wants more food, money, power, status, attention, until eventually we've consumed everything around us and we're still hungry. Maybe that's why the Wendigos have survived for this long, because the oldest monsters aren't necessarily the ones hiding in the dark. Sometimes they're the ones that ask us what we would become if everything we loved was taken away. And somewhere in the frozen forests of the north, the wind is still moving through the trees. You can't see anything, but then you hear footsteps, and there he is, baby, the Wendigo. And also, I'm pretty sure you're not supposed to say the word Wendigo at all. According to Folklore, I think it attracts them. And I at least said it 50 times in this video. So, wish me luck, gang. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what topic you'd like me to cover in the future and what poster you'd want me to draw. I appreciate you guys for hanging out, and I'll see you next time. Peace.